Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Renomirani historičar i profesor na univerzitetima Oxford i Firenca. Njegova najnovija knjiga, Novi atlantski poredak, istražuje transformaciju transatlantskih veza i svjetskog poretka nakon Drugog svjetskog rata. O današnjim odnosima SAD-a i Evrope, američkom vojnom intervencionizmu, Rusiji i Kini, za Al Jazeeru govori Cohrs.
Professor Cohrs, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, allow me to begin by asking you, your latest book, The New Atlantic Order, offers an original interpretation of how and why the international order was transformed at the dawn of the 20th century. What exactly prompted you to write this book, and how long was it in the making?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Kacic, for having me and for allowing me to talk about my book. So in many ways, I started out with a question that comes back to my first book, which was called The Unfinished Peace After World War I. And that's indeed the question, why was it so tremendously difficult to create a modern international order and preserve peace, on a modern base after the great catastrophe of the First World War, which came to overshadow the 20th century. And I came to realize that one had to basically look at a much wider and broader context to answer this question. So not just at the Paris Peace Conference or even the impact of this war itself, but to understand what had led to this catastrophe. So this in turn led me to think in a new way, I hope, about what I call the long 20th century, which starts in the 1860s when the modern states began to form and compete. And this takes us across the era of the two world wars and peacemaking and reordering efforts all the way to the kind of post-Second World War order that in many ways I think still is at the core of what we might today call the very embattled international order that, a rule-based international order that we see. So these were the questions, and this led me to a long process of research because I tried to write this book not from a particular perspective, American, European, German, French, or other, but in a comprehensive way, and trying to do justice to the big changes, the bird's eye view, but also the different architects and those who attempted to build a new order, and also those who were trying to be part of these reordering processes. For example, anti-colonial nationalists and those who try to get rid of imperial domination, but who were not at the table in 1919. So I also try to give their voices room in my analysis. So it took me, let's say, more than 10 years to write this book. And what is more, it's just the second volume of a trilogy that I'm trying to write on the transformation of the modern global order. So I'm still busy now on the final volume of this trilogy.
Now, Professor, when you look at events with the wisdom of hindsight, why was it impossible to forge a Euro-Atlantic peace after World War I?
Yeah, that is the big question. And as I mentioned, I think one has to understand the wider prehistory of this war. So in a short way, one could say the challenges were massive because the First World War did not just lead to immense, more than 10 millions of casualties of deaths and tremendous losses of life in Europe and beyond. It also led to a breakdown of the kind of international system that had existed before 1914, but that in itself had been very war-prone. It had not been a very legitimate and stable order. And so the legacy of this pre-history of the First World War was that of the era of high imperialism, when all those who tried to be real world powers engaged in an ever more excessive competition to dominate in the world. And they created, in my interpretation, a kind of hierarchy and an instability with the globalization of Euro-Atlantic power politics, with the United States coming into this kind of game of imperialism, this had major impact, for example, on China at that time, with Japan entering this competition. So in 1918, when the main war in the West ended, it was not just the question of settling the German problem or some minor questions. This was really a kind of a juncture, a watershed, at which there was a real need to build something that had not existed before, a modern, rule-based international order. And now a further complication was that those who were the victors of this great war were, for the most part, the Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States, were imperfect but nonetheless democratic powers. So those who were trying to make peace, they did not only have to negotiate compromises at the peace conference in Paris, they also had to keep in mind what they could legitimize towards their home audiences. And this war had created immense expectations of what was supposed to happen that were also conflicting. Some were seeking greater security against renewed German aggression, in France, for example. In Britain, many people sought reparations for the tremendous sacrifices this war had brought. In the United States, you had many activists who said, this should be the time when America should step in, the United States, and build not just a League of Nations, but also a new kind of democratic international order. Yet the United States, that was had been now cast in the leading role in the world, hardly had any major experience in negotiating, in cooperating with others, in taking responsibility for the international sort of system in terms of security, in terms of economic oversight. So think about all these layers of challenges, and then a situation after 1918, at which the First World War had also created tremendous, it had led to an ideological war. It had created tremendous divisions between different peoples. And so these were very complicated conditions for making peace. And that's why part of what my book tries to show is that it was very unrealistic to expect that even the biggest peace conference ever would be able to settle all these questions and create a new order that then just had to be enforced. Rather, it was very crucial to gain basic understandings about what were supposed to be the new ground rules of international politics. For example, international law, as then we saw in the League Covenant, what should provide security. A new idea of collective security, no longer the competing alliances that had existed before 1914, but now the kind of common idea of security that we later find after the Second World War in the United Nations, but also in a collective security organization like NATO.
NATO, yeah. But Professor, do you believe that any European order based solely on military containment is doomed unless it addresses the deeper sources of European conflicts? Yeah,
in general terms, I would say so. But so to illustrate that, if we go back 100 years, there was a big Russian question at the time. What would happen with Russia? What would happen with a country that at that point was in the throes of a civil war? It was not clear yet. Would the Bolsheviks prevail? Would there be a Soviet Union? Or would the white counter-revolutionary forces in the end win? So that was one big question. But the core and the key problem was really at that point the German problem. And there were very different answers given by the peacemakers as to how that was supposed to be handled. And especially in France, there was an understandable preoccupation with security and the idea that the only way to make peace in Europe was to contain Germany by force. There were also other French ideas, so there was quite a spectrum. But Clemenceau, the prime minister at that time, had this vision that only from containment and a position of strength, not allowing Germany ever to wage a major war again, could one then, over time, build reconciliation, integration. But others, for example, the British government, and especially under Lloyd George, and especially the American president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, they wanted to create a different kind of order where this kind of containment was really not the central concern, although they also thought that Germany was supposed to be disarmed. But nonetheless, their focus was really on building a new kind of concert within the League of Nations, in which a Germany that would have undergone major changes, namely became a republic, so shed the legacy of the German Empire, and became a republic, and basically committed itself to the ground rules of the Western powers, should be allowed into this new order. So here I see parallels. When we later talk about the Cold War, the big question became, so what do you do vis-a-vis the Soviet Union? Is containment enough? Is military containment enough? And as you might know, a famous architect of containment like George F. Kennan would argue, no, this is not enough. One also has to provide political answers and eventually think about sort of building political bridges, while at the same time ensuring that some power does not transgress or violate the rules. And this, I think, leads us eventually, we can maybe talk about that later, to the challenges we face today when we think about not just how to end the war in Ukraine, but also how to provide a future, some sort of place for Russia.
We'll touch upon Ukraine.
In the new world order, yes.
Professor, we'll touch upon Ukraine at a later stage. But now let me ask you, following the end of World War II and the denazification of Europe, of Germany primarily, Europe went through a metamorphosis. Have Europeans and Americans alike believed that they had created a set of rules that would preserve peace not only on their continents, but eventually throughout the entire world?
Yeah, so this is what my current book, The New Atlantic Order, ends with. It tries to show that especially American and European policymakers thought after 1945 that they had really learned some deeper lessons, deeper lessons that would lead to the European Recovery Program, the integration of the Western Germany, the creation of the North Atlantic Alliance, commitments by the United States and others to a common security architecture, economic architecture, but also basically a kind of cooperation between democratic states. And there were many, as there had been already in 1919, who thought Europe and the United States could be sort of the exemplary states. They could show the rest of the world from a position of hierarchical and a feeling of hierarchical superiority, how one could get out of the old ways and the old kind of problematic international politics towards a new sort of era. Yet, as I also show in my book, this kind of thinking often went hand in hand with a lot of double standards, with hypocrisy and, for example, with the fact that for a long time, two of the main sort of members of this New Atlantic Order were also empires, global empires. Britain, of course, first and foremost, but also France. And so they accepted certain rules in the Atlantic sphere that they did not accept in the rest of the world. And the United States similarly, acted quite differently towards Europe and Western Europe in particular when compared to its actions in Latin America, in China earlier, and in East Asia, where there was much more of a kind of neo-imperial impetus. So I'm trying to show that some of the most interesting intellectuals and policymakers were trying to grapple with these problems and were trying to eradicate them. But nonetheless, this was not solved. So there's always a tension between this idea that there's an Atlantic heart of a world order, and then there is a global order, and one has to really distinguish between, in my view, between propaganda on the one hand and speech making about the great universal values and world politics on the one hand, and actions and real pursuit of interest on the other. And my argument is that if they are not congruent, if there's a big gap, discrepancy between what people advocate, from Wilson's making the world safe for democracy towards the Truman Doctrine, and later the US proclamations after the end of the Cold War, and on the other hand, the kinds of actions that were taken eventually, for example, vis-a-vis Iraq or in other instances, then this is a real challenge of legitimacy.
Right, I mean, but this order built with the US and European partners in the shadow of the Cold War and organized around, security alliances, open markets, multilateral cooperation and democratic values. I mean, it has provided a foundation and operating logic for modern world politics. But do you feel that this order is being challenged now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I very much think so. And part of why, there's another kind of layer of motivation for me to write this book and work on the following book. And this is basically the question, I mentioned earlier, the long 20th century. So the question that I try to answer is, are we coming towards the end of this long 20th century where the kind of international order that we've just been talking about is really challenged, not just from outside, from external pressures, let's say Chinese behavior, Russian aggression and others, but also from within, namely by the fact that if you think of the different currents within the US, Trumpism, populism, others that don't want to have honor commitments that one used to take for granted from the United States anymore, and also within Europe. So how capable are Europeans not just to talk about a European security architecture and partnership with the United States, but also to implement their policies? We see this in Ukraine at this point. So I think this is a time of reckoning where I hope that looking at the wider prehistory of how difficult it was, but also what a tremendous achievement it was to build this order, should lead us to think more carefully about how to preserve it, yet also how to develop it further for the 21st century, when we have to think differently about whom to include and how to deal with all the other parts of the world. This cannot be thought of in isolation, in my view. And the obvious challenge is that you have other, if you take Putin, you have other rationales of saying, well, there's basically the law of the stronger again. There are, or we might say, autocratic models that combine some form of capitalism, but a very rigid authoritarian leadership. They are the models of the future. And this Atlantic system has prevailed in former instances, when from the 1930s onwards, it was challenged by Hitler Germany, authoritarian Japan, and later Stalinist Russia, Soviet Union. But this is I think this is the big game now. This is the big question. And that's why the Ukraine conflict is about much more than just Ukraine.
I mean, Professor, nearly 8 years have passed since the end of World War II. We know that the US still garrisons troops in Germany, in Japan. It has increased its military presence in the Baltics, in Poland. So the Atlantic region still remains organized around American-led Western partnership. Can Europe defend itself without the US?
Well, as I mentioned, I think if Europeans are honest, they have to take a very hard look at beyond Sunday speeches. And I especially think here not so much of France, for example, and other European states, but at about the central state and power Germany that is undergoing a tremendous phase of change and of questioning. So it's been called a turning of the tide, at least by the Chancellor Scholz in his speech in February. But the actions that have to go along with, for example, investing not just in the German armed forces, but also in strategic cooperation, and to really pull one's weight within NATO, within the effort to support Ukraine, there is still a lot that is lacking, that does not live up at all to these big announcements. And I think this is the big challenge for Europe in a broader scheme. In my view, it's not so much about emancipating and going away from the United States. It's to be a more emancipated partner within let's say the second pillar in a Euro-Atlantic order, because in the grander scheme, Europe is not even close to having the kinds of capabilities that at this point only the United States can provide. So I am very much an advocate of cooperating with the more reasonable political leaders, forces and strengthening transatlantic ties with the United States, not against the United States. But the obvious risk is here that there could be developments within the United States, resurgence of Trumpism or something along those lines, that makes such cooperation much, much harder. And then the Europeans really would be challenged to get their own act together. But we are not there yet. And of course, this is also a big question for post-Brexit Britain, how to position itself. And it would like to be, I think, a mediator between the two different sides of the Atlantic. Churchill already had this in mind, but that is also far from the present reality. So I think one has to have take some hard look at strategic realities and get away from the slightly infantilized kind of politics that have become so commonplace in Europe for many years.
Now, we know that during the Cold War, America's pursuit of its national interests, and the construction of a progressive and mutually agreeable global order went hand in hand. But today, America is, in the world, they seem to be increasingly estranged. And why is anti-Americanism becoming a prominent feature in many regions of the world, including among Cold War allies such as Turkey?
I think, the reasons have to be sought both in the United States and its behavior on the one hand, but also in developments within different other parts of the world that have to do with the nature of, for example, the Erdogan regime within Turkey and what it has to do to stay in power. So, but looking at the US side for a moment, clearly, this comes back to a point I was trying to make earlier. If there's a clear kind of hypocrisy and a gap between the big proclamations of doing everything for the best of world order, and that there is something like an alignment of US and global interest or US and regional interests on the one hand, if this is proclaimed, but at the same time the US is actually pursuing unilateral policies under the Bush Jr. Administration in Iraq, or in other instances that clearly clash, and are just corroding these proclamations, then this, of course, rightfully should lead to criticism of US double standards. This is, of course, also politicized then and taken, is useful for propaganda of those who might also be critical of US policies, but also want to strengthen their own power bases at the expense of the US. So in earlier days, American policymakers like Kennan, I mentioned him, they thought a lot about how to cultivate alliances, how to cultivate cooperation while also pursuing US interests. I think the Biden administration is pursuing policies more in this tradition again, but there's been a long interlude in which the United States was either not sufficiently engaged or simply taking for granted that the kind of globalization it was seeking, and that it also, this is not just a question of the US government, but US companies and big corporations would also somehow trickle down and benefit all of mankind. And this is as little true as is the promise that unfettered capitalism will simply be the best model we've ever had in this world. So this is not just an American problem, but I think sometimes these the wider sources of discontent are then being projected onto the United States. So this is a challenge for American political leadership to deal with.
And finally, Russia is not the only nation in the world that covets its neighbor's territory. What message does Russia's invasion of Ukraine send to countries such as China, bearing in mind its irredentist aspirations towards Taiwan? And what message is the US sending to China with its firm military support to Kiev?
So I think this exactly relates to the bigger picture I was trying to paint. The war in Ukraine is at the core of several rings of big struggles that currently characterize world politics. And the basic question, I think, is whether the international community, most states, still want to maintain certain ground rules of non-interference, of self-determination, of respect for sovereignty that have also been violated in the past by some of its key members, including the United States. So that's also definitely a challenge. But will they have the political will to say this is a kind of transgression that will not go unanswered? And so I think the Chinese leadership is studying and evaluating very carefully what kind of stakes would be involved in getting more serious about changing the status of Taiwan, of really sort of breaking the kinds of understandings that still prevail in the Pacific. And I think one can see, not just in the reaction of the United States, that is not just supporting Ukraine, but also is beefing up its strategic posture in the Pacific, but also in the reaction of a power like Japan, that is in the midst of going away from a more pacifist post-World War II stance towards saying they will actually have to have capabilities and not just rely on the Americans. So these are all kind of signals in the wider game. And so I think, while on the one hand, all of these powers are still very interdependent in terms of trade and economic relations and politically, we have a real struggle, that is a bit sort of makes one sort of think back to the phases of the Cold War, when everything became into this kind of systemic competition. And the lesson, I think, partly from that is that, from a Western perspective, it takes a combination of clear strength, so negotiating from a position of strength and showing that one is willing to support a cause such as the Ukrainian, for example, on the one hand, but then also to think about a future perspective, not just in the self-interest of the West, but also in a more global interest, where if one is interested in rules that govern international relations, they have to apply for everyone. And not just, they cannot only be invoked if it's in the interest of the West and basically ignored when it is not. And here, all of the Western states, but especially the United States, have a lot of homework to do.
Right, Professor Patrick Cohrs, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.